I'd love to know where you're watching from. It's always amazing to see how far these stories travel across the world. Your thoughts and presence truly mean a lot to me. If you're enjoying these historical tales, kindly subscribe to the channel. London, 1815. The war had ended, but the city still carried its echoes, in the cautious laughter of officers returned from the continent, in the mourning veils of widows who still stood at the edges of ballroom floors, and in the way the streets glimmered with a kind of weary splendor, as though beauty itself were attempting to heal the wounds of empire. Within the gilded drawing-rooms of Mayfair, the season was beginning, that annual pageant of alliances and ambition. Every chandelier burned like a promise, every dance card was a wager. The Prince Regent's indulgence had turned London into a theater of silk and scandal, and the audience was always eager for a new performance. Amid this swirl of privilege and vanity lived Lady Eleanor Whitcomb, the only daughter of the late Baronet Whitcomb of Surrey. Her father's debts had extinguished what remained of the family fortune, and his sudden death left her and her mother to inhabit a modest house on the edge of Grosvenor Square, close enough to smell the perfume of grandeur, but too far to ever claim it. Their drawing-room was neat and pale, a world of careful restraint, where hope was folded away each morning like a letter that had never been sent. Yet even in quiet decline, Eleanor carried herself with a composure that unsettled her peers. She was not beautiful in the fashion of the season. Her features were too thoughtful, her gaze too steady. But there was something in her manner that suggested both strength and stillness, as if she saw through the ornament of the world and pitted it gently. Society tolerated her presence because she was polite, but it never forgot her poverty, and in that memory her worth was continually diminished. She smiled rarely, spoke with precision, and read too much for her own good. It was in the echoing halls of the British Museum that the Duke of Ashbourne first noticed her. He had returned from the war only months before, his title restored to him after years in uniform, his expression shaped by discipline and disappointment. Nicholas Everley, 8th Duke of Ashbourne, was a man the world admired but did not approach. Tall, angular, with the grave eyes of one who had seen men die for causes now debated over tea, he inspired both fascination and unease. His estate stretched across 3 counties. His word could make or unmake fortunes. Yet those who knew him best whispered that he was not a man of warmth but of iron, a duke molded more by duty than by desire. That morning, he stood before a marble bust of Augustus, lost in private reflection, when he heard a quiet correction delivered to the curator nearby. "I believe the translation you've quoted is from Ovid, not Virgil," a woman's voice said, clear but unassuming. Turning, he found her standing at a respectful distance, her gloved hands clasped before her, her tone untainted by self-importance. The curator blustered, uncertain, but the Duke felt no such confusion. He recognized authority when he heard it. Eleanor had not realized who he was until she noticed how the air seemed to shift around him, how people straightened or looked away. Their eyes met only briefly, yet in that instant she sensed his scrutiny, sharp and assessing. She inclined her head and left without apology. For the first time in years, Nicholas found himself intrigued not by beauty, but by composure. He made inquiries later, and when her name was spoken, Lady Eleanor Whitcomb, daughter of the ruined baronet, he dismissed the thought of her. A lady of reduced means, with neither dowry nor connections, was not the concern of a man in his position. His mother had already begun selecting suitable brides, and he treated the process as one treats a state business: necessary, dull, inevitable. Yet when spring unfurled over London, their paths crossed again, this time beneath chandeliers rather than museum skylights. The Prince Regent's masquerade was the triumph of the season, an opulent pageant where masks permitted brief rebellion. Silk rustled like whispered secrets, violins wept behind gilded screens. Every guest wore both disguise and desire. Eleanor had not intended to attend. The invitation arrived through Lady Pennington, an old family friend who pitied her situation and insisted that absence would only invite further gossip. Reluctantly, Eleanor borrowed a gown from her cousin, a pale ivory satin, a little too grand, its hem slightly frayed, and a simple mask that concealed nothing of her sincerity. As she entered Carlton House, she felt the familiar chill of curiosity ripple around her. Eyes weighed her lineage, not her soul. The Duke, masked in black and silver, surveyed the ballroom with the weariness of a man long accustomed to admiration. He had danced out of duty, spoken out of habit, and found little amusement in either. Then a laugh caught his attention, soft, genuine, unguarded. Turning, he saw her again. She stood by the balcony doors, speaking to a young officer about the astronomy lectures she'd once attended, her words bright and quick. Her mask glimmered faintly in the candlelight, but her presence seemed lit from within. He approached before he could stop himself. Their conversation began with the customary civility of strangers, but soon strayed into dangerous honesty. She spoke of books, of the hollow charm of society, of how women were trained to smile at men they did not respect. He replied with equal candor, confessing that he found much of London tiresome after the discipline of the field. For a brief interval, they forgot the world that watched them. When the unmasking hour arrived, the Duke removed his mask with the ease of one accustomed to revelation. She hesitated, then lifted hers, and recognition dawned. The scholar from the museum stood before him, the woman he had quietly dismissed as unworthy of attention. He felt a flicker of discomfort, swiftly concealed. She saw the change in his eyes and knew at once what he remembered. The orchestra swelled, dancers resumed, and the crowd swallowed them. Yet something lingered in the space between them, curiosity sharpened by pride, attraction restrained by station. He bowed, murmured a courteous farewell, and retreated into the crush of silk and laughter. She watched him go, a faint smile at her lips that even she could not interpret. Later, as she stood at the edge of the ballroom, half hidden behind a marble pillar, Eleanor observed the glittering multitude, dukes, duchesses, debutantes, all playing their parts with desperate precision. She realized, with a mixture of clarity and sorrow, that she was no more suited to this theater than he was. Yet where he wore his restraint like armor, she bore hers as defiance. When the clock struck midnight, she left quietly, unnoticed amid the whirl of departing carriages. The night air was cool against her skin, scented faintly with rain. Behind her, the palace blazed with light and laughter, a world that would never truly claim her. Ahead lay darkness, uncertainty, and a curious sense of freedom. And somewhere inside that radiant palace, the Duke of Ashbourne stood alone on the balcony, the mask still warm in his hand, wondering, though he would not admit it, why the thought of a woman he deemed unsuitable refused to leave his mind. Whispers spread through London faster than any carriage could travel. By the following week, every salon and supper table was murmuring about the Duke of Ashbourne's uncharacteristic attentiveness to the impoverished Lady Eleanor Whitcomb. No one could quite name what had passed between them at the Prince Regent's masquerade, but the speculation was intoxicating. Some claimed he had asked her to dance twice, others insisted he had spoken to her in the garden, and one inventive matron swore she had seen them standing too close by the balcony. Truth mattered little. The illusion of scandal was far more delicious. Eleanor became the reluctant subject of a narrative not her own. Invitations once absent began to appear again, each carrying a subtle promise of curiosity. She attended with measured grace, knowing that each entrance she made was not a welcome but an examination. The ladies greeted her with smiles as sharp as needles, and the gentlemen regarded her with a blend of amusement and opportunism. Yet she endured it all with the same quiet composure that had drawn attention to her in the first place. If she noticed the Duke at such gatherings, always distant, always surrounded by admirers, she gave no sign. Nicholas Everley, for his part, found the gossip both irksome and impossible to ignore. He had not meant to notice her again, yet his mind betrayed him. In the days following the ball, he found himself recalling her voice, her poise, and the faint look of disappointment in her eyes when she recognized him. It unsettled him more than he cared to admit. 4 years, he had been praised for his control, his discernment. Yet the image of a penniless lady with borrowed pearls had begun to intrude upon his every moment of solitude. He convinced himself that what drew him was curiosity, not affection. He had seen courage in battle, loyalty in friendship, but rarely intellect in a drawing-room. She challenged him merely by existing outside his expectations. Still, he avoided her, reasoning that distance would return him to reason. But distance only sharpened awareness. Each mention of her name in conversation pricked at him like a thorn. It was Lady Pennington who, whether by design or coincidence, brought them together again. Her spring soirée was among the most anticipated of the season, an evening of polished laughter and discreet matchmaking. Eleanor attended reluctantly, hoping to remain invisible. The Duke came out of obligation, determined to endure the event and depart before midnight. Fate, however, had other intentions. As the guests circulated beneath the painted ceilings, a commotion broke the genteel rhythm. A maid, pale and trembling, stood accused of theft. A diamond brooch belonging to the Duchess of Claremont had vanished, and suspicion had fallen upon her instantly. The hostess's attempts at diplomacy faltered under the weight of noble outrage. A small crowd formed, eager for entertainment disguised as moral concern. The maid denied the charge through tears, but few listened. It was easier to condemn the powerless than to question the privileged. Eleanor stepped forward before she could stop herself. Her voice, calm but steady, cut through the murmuring. "You cannot accuse without proof," she said. "To disgrace a servant without evidence is to confess the weakness of your own integrity." The room stilled. Her words, spoken without apology, hung in the air like a challenge. The Duchess bristled. "And what would you have us do, Lady Eleanor? Allow thieves to go unpunished because they cry prettily?" Eleanor met her gaze. "I would have you remember that justice is not inherited with a title." Her mother's lessons, her father's failings, her own hardships, all converged in that single act of defiance. She turned to the maid, noticing the terror in the girl's hands, the raw pleading in her eyes. "Did anyone search the table where the brooch was last seen?" The Duke had been silent until that moment, observing from the edge of the circle. He stepped forward now, his tone low but commanding. "Indeed," he said, "I believe it would be wise to do so before we condemn anyone." At his word, the crowd shifted uneasily. Servants hurried to obey. Within minutes, the missing jewel was discovered, lodged in the embroidery of a curtain, dropped, not stolen. A wave of embarrassed relief swept through the room. Eleanor turned toward him, their eyes meeting briefly. There was gratitude in hers, something like respect. He bowed slightly, acknowledging her courage more than her gratitude. But the others were not so forgiving. To challenge a duchess and be vindicated was, in some ways, worse than being wrong. As the murmurs resumed, the Duke crossed to her side. "You have a talent for inviting trouble," he said quietly. "I did not seek it," she replied. "It was already in the room." He smiled, a small, unguarded thing, gone almost as soon as it appeared. Then, as the company began to disperse, something remarkable occurred. A murmur of disapproval rippled through the crowd, subtle yet unmistakable. The Duchess's friends turned away, whispering behind their fans. Eleanor, sensing the tide turning against her, prepared to withdraw. But before she could, the Duke of Ashbourne did something no one in that room would forget. He reached for her gloved hand, bowed his head, and pressed his lips gently upon it. The gesture was neither flirtation nor mockery, it was recognition. A silent tribute from one spirit to another. The music had stopped, and the air held its breath. When he straightened, his expression was composed, but his eyes betrayed something unspoken. The silence shattered in an instant. Laughter, polite and brittle, filled the void. Someone made a jest, someone else whispered the word, impertinent. Yet the moment had already rooted itself in memory. In the language of the ton, that single kiss was an act of scandal, an elevation of a woman deemed unworthy, a violation of every unspoken rule. Eleanor withdrew from the room with quiet dignity, her pulse a storm beneath her composure. She did not look back, though she felt his gaze follow her until she vanished beyond the doorway. The night air outside felt colder than before, or perhaps she had simply lost the illusion of safety that society's indifference once provided. By morning, the story had grown. It was said that the Duke had declared his affection publicly, that he intended to propose, that Lady Eleanor had bewitched him. Each retelling twisted the truth further until she scarcely recognized it. The ton was delighted. What greater amusement than the downfall of a man too proud to guard his reputation? For Nicholas, the gesture had not been planned. He had acted upon instinct, the same instinct that led him once into battle without thought for consequence. Yet the repercussions were swift. His mother's letter arrived before dawn, cold and precise, reminding him of his duty to the family line. The peers who once courted his approval now watched him with wary calculation. Still, in the quiet that followed, he found he could not regret it. The memory of her hand in his lingered with unsettling clarity. He saw again the strength beneath her restraint, the dignity that had defied a room full of power. For the first time, he felt something close to admiration that was not born of rank or achievement, but of moral courage. Eleanor, meanwhile, bore the cost of his gallantry. Invitations dwindled. Polite nods became cool glances. Yet in her heart, a strange calm took root. The scandal had freed her from the illusion she had once half believed, that virtue alone could preserve a woman in a world built upon appearance. As spring faded into summer, London turned its attention to new amusements, but for the Duke and Lady Eleanor, the season had altered everything. One act of conscience, one impulsive kiss, had set their names side by side in every whispered conversation, a union of pride and principle that neither could undo. And somewhere, beneath the noise of rumor and reproach, both began to wonder whether the truth of that moment had been worth the ruin it carried. The scandal did not die quickly. It lingered like perfume after a dance, clinging to every conversation that dared speak the Duke of Ashbourne's name. The Tun found endless fascination in his defiance, in the image of England's most eligible nobleman lowering himself before a woman with no dowry, no influence, and no apparent purpose beyond her quiet intelligence. Weeks passed, yet the tale only grew more polished in the retelling, until even those who had witnessed it began to doubt what they had truly seen. The Duke himself offered no defense. His silence became its own declaration, and society, deprived of explanation, condemned him all the more eagerly. Nicholas withdrew from the whirl of the season. Invitations went unanswered, engagements forgotten. His mother visited once, unannounced, bringing with her the sharp chill of disappointment. She spoke not as a mother but as a guardian of legacy, reminding him that the Everley name had survived centuries precisely because its bearers had not indulged sentiment. Her words, though measured, struck like accusations. "You have been foolish, Nicholas. Affection is the privilege of men with nothing to lose." He said little, for what could he offer her but truth? That for the first time since the war, he had acted not from duty but from instinct. In the solitude of Ashbourne Manor, surrounded by portraits of ancestors whose marriages had been signed like treaties, he began to understand the cost of his gesture. He was expected to marry Lady Sophia Carroway, a woman of impeccable lineage and ample fortune, whose conversation never once deviated from the weather or the waltz. She would make a perfect duchess, dignified, obedient, forgettable. Yet when Nicholas tried to picture her beside him, he felt only the weight of obligation pressing down like a chain. Eleanor, meanwhile, had disappeared from London. Her mother's health had declined, and with it, their last remaining pretext for attending society's gatherings. They retreated to a modest cottage near Surrey, where the air was clear and unjudging. The countryside, with its slow mornings and quiet evenings, suited Eleanor's temperament more than she had expected. She read by the window, tended the garden, and tried to let time smooth the ache that London had left behind. Yet despite the tranquility, she could not forget the look in the Duke's eyes that night. Not admiration, not pity, but something she had never been offered before, understanding. Letters arrived from acquaintances offering sympathy disguised as curiosity. She answered none. When the Duke's first letter came, brief, formal, and written in a restrained hand, she stared at it for hours before opening it. He had written simply to inquire after her mother's health, but between the lines she sensed what was unsaid. She did not reply. A week later, another came, gentler this time, almost apologetic. "Forgive my intrusion, but silence is a burden I cannot bear. I do not seek your gratitude, only your honesty." She folded it carefully and placed it in a drawer, telling herself she would forget it. But she never did. Summer deepened into autumn, and the Duke found excuses to journey south, ostensibly to inspect his tenant farms. One afternoon, as Eleanor walked along a shaded lane near the edge of the property, she heard the distant rhythm of hooves. She turned and saw him dismounting at the gate. No retinue, no pretense, only a man in simple riding clothes, his posture less proud than she remembered. "Lady Eleanor," he greeted, removing his gloves. "Your Grace," she replied, the formality cutting through the tension like glass. He looked at her for a moment, as if relearning the shape of her face. "I fear I owe you an apology that cannot be neatly phrased," he said. "My actions in London were entirely your own," she interrupted. "You owe me nothing." "That is untrue," he said quietly. You defended a stranger at cost to your reputation. I defended you because it was right, and yet it is you who have paid the heavier price. She regarded him steadily. Then allow me to pay it in peace. The simplicity of her words struck him harder than any reproach. For a long moment, neither spoke. The wind stirred the leaves between them. Finally, he said, "You think me a fool, I suspect." "I think you a man who confuses remorse with affection," she said, her voice soft but unwavering. "You kissed my hand because you could not bear the injustice of the moment. It was noble, yes, but nobility and love are not the same." He might have argued, but the truth of her observation silenced him. He bowed his head slightly, as if accepting a verdict. "Perhaps," he murmured. "Yet in these months of silence, I have found no satisfaction in any other thought." She felt the faint tremor of sincerity in his tone and, against her will, a tenderness that frightened her. But she had seen what society could do to a woman who mistook admiration for safety. "Your Grace," she said after a pause, "I wish you peace truly. But I will not be your rebellion against convention. I will not stand between a man and the future his name demands." He nodded, though disappointment flickered in his expression. "Then I will not ask it of you." He replaced his gloves, the gesture practiced but weary. "If ever you find that peace too heavy to bear, you know where I am." When he was gone, the lane seemed emptier than before. Eleanor returned home, heart steady but sorrowful. She had long believed that dignity required sacrifice, yet she had never imagined how lonely that truth could feel. Months passed. Winter arrived early that year, frosting the hedgerows and silencing the fields. Ashbourne Manor hosted no celebrations. Its master declined every invitation, citing health. In truth, he found himself haunted not by regret but by memory, the image of a woman standing unbowed before judgment, her courage a mirror to his own hidden longing for freedom. It was December when their paths crossed again, by chance or providence. A charity gathering for veterans was held in Westminster, and both had been persuaded to attend. Snow drifted through the city, settling softly upon carriages and stone. Inside the hall, the air was warm with candlelight and song. Eleanor stood near a window, her gown of simple gray silk catching the glow of the chandeliers. She did not notice him approach until his reflection appeared beside hers in the glass. "I had almost forgotten how silent the snow can make a city," he said. She turned. "And I had almost forgotten how persistent you are." He smiled faintly. "I have given up on pride. It brings no comfort." She studied him, the lines of weariness softened, his voice less guarded. "You should not have come." "I thought the same," he replied, "and yet here we are." They spoke quietly, as the choir began to sing. He told her he had broken the engagement his family arranged, not for her, but because he could no longer pretend that convenience was virtue. She listened, unsure whether to admire his conviction or pity his solitude. When the final hymn faded, he turned to her and said, almost as if to himself, "I once told myself you were unsuitable to be a wife. I was wrong. You are unsuitable only to be forgotten." She did not answer. The words hung between them, trembling like the last note of a song. Then he bowed, not as a duke to a lady, but as a man acknowledging another soul, and left her standing in the dim light, watching the snow fall against the window-panes. Later, the narrator might have said that their story ended there, suspended between what was lost and what might yet be found. But history, like love, is seldom tidy. The scandal faded, names were replaced by new ones, and time moved as it always does, indifferent and unstoppable. Yet somewhere, beneath the hush of a winter sky, two lives remain forever bound by a single moment of defiance, when a duke bent before a woman and the world, for one breathless instant, remembered that even the proudest heart can kneel.